amplify any points made during your evidence or have any additional points to make, you are welcome to submit supplementary evidence to us. If you would like to introduce your collaborators and yourself to us, and then I understand you'd like to make an opening statement, which would be very welcome to the committee, and then we go into questions.
My Lord Chairman, I'm Tobias Billström, and I'm the Swedish Minister for Migration and Asylum Policy since 2006. And since 2002 I have served as a member of the Swedish Parliament, representing the city of Malmö and the Moderate Party. And I'm also the Swedish representative of the Justice and Home Affairs in the Council of the European Union. And joining me here today is first Liselott Åberg, who is the director at the Department for Asylum and Migration Policy with the Ministry of Justice in Sweden, and Mr.
Andreas van der Kant.
Yes, who is from our embassy here in London. My Lord Chairman, thank you for inviting me to this hearing, and I'm honored to have been asked to talk about the global approach to migration and mobility, not only because it started as a UK initiative in 2005, but also because it is my view that the global approach in essence is an EU success story. Sweden has from the beginning supported the idea of the global approach to migration and its development in becoming the overall framework of the EU external migration policy. It is my belief that the global approach has contributed to create true and genuine cooperation and partnerships with third countries of strategic importance to the EU by being a constructive method for dialogue and cooperation. And this method provides for the opportunity to discuss all aspects of migration. That is the broad thematic migration agenda, including the more sensitive issues. The EU has also reached a unique position in this global context through the development of the partnership idea as a kind of trademark. For the overall fruitful implementation of the global approach, a few fundamental angles could be outlined. The starting point is the long-term perspective through a broad and integrated approach to migration. The second angle is that EU internal solidarity is required through political, thematical and geographic balance. And finally, it also implies greater policy coherence within migration policy fields as well as with other policy areas. And I would like, if you permit me, to elaborate on some of these aspects. First, the European Commission's communication on the global approach to migration and mobility, as well as the Council conclusions that were adopted last month, enables the global approach framework to become truly comprehensive, more strategic and efficient. A step in this direction has been achieved by encompassing very clearly the issue of international protection and the external dimension of asylum as the fourth main area of the framework. And the global approach thereby, not only in reality but also in formal structure, covers all areas of migration issues in relation to dialogue and cooperation with third countries. Second, one of the core issues of the global approach is the balance between the thematic and geographic aspects. All 27 EU member states naturally have their own priorities. However, there is an understanding amongst member states not to challenge this balance and consensus, using the global approach to its full extent, rather gives room for each and everyone's priorities. And to keep the balance in the global approach therefore forms the starting point of member states' responsibilities, commitments and interests, which is fundamental for the EU's credibility towards third countries. And third and last, policy coherence between EU migration policy and other areas, such as foreign policy and development cooperation, is an important aspect of the global approach, as well as to integrate the framework as part of the EU's foreign policy. And the EU needs to seek and utilize synergies also with other areas such as trade, education and health. And this is a challenge and an area where the EU will have to increase its efforts in years to come. And my Lord Chairman, with these few introductory words, I am at your disposal to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful, and effectively I think you've answered quite a bit of the first question I was going to put to you, but if I could perhaps just pick up on something you said there. If I understood you rightly, what you were saying was that the global approach recognizes that individual member states will have often quite rather different policies with regard to some parts of the agenda that's covered by migration and mobility, and that it therefore in a way meets the requirements of subsidiarity. That's to say that it's not trying to centralize everything in Brussels. It is recognizing that individual states will have rather different responses to some parts of the agenda, but this doesn't mean they can't work together on others, in particular towards third countries. Have I got that right?
Well, my Lord Chairman, I think that you are absolutely right. In relation to the global approach, the issue of the EU speaking with one voice, that is to say, is complex. And it is difficult to give a clear-cut answer. After all, this is about who is going to represent the EU. Is it the Commission of the European Union, the External Action Service, or the Presidency? And depending on the situation, it could probably be either of them. And another question is who is going to implement the global approach? And in my view, this is a joint responsibility according to the respective institutional competencies. And I think that the global approach definitely gives each of the 27 member states plenty of room for maneuver and a possibility to implement the approach in a coherent and joint way, but also giving room for the member states' own priorities.
Thank you. We heard from our witness last week, Peter Sutherland, that there was in fact difficulty in allowing the Commission to be present at the global forum that he is going to be chairing in Mauritius. That at least one member state was objecting very strongly to that. Can you cast any light on that discussion?
Well, thank you very much, my Lord Chairman. Thank you very much for this question as well. Mr. Sutherland is an admirable man with which I have a good cooperation with, as Sweden is the incoming presidency of the global Forum on Migration and Development, which is incidentally going to take place in Stockholm in the spring of 2014. The EU has come very far in terms of coordination in multilateral fora. Indeed we have. And we often speak with one voice within the United Nations. The fact that EU has made a considerable progress in terms of coordination in the field of migration, especially through the global approach, is and I think should be highlighted in such multilateral settings. However, and this is a point where I think it's important to be very clear on the subject. Different multilateral initiatives fill different functions. and thus require different approaches. And the Global Forum on Migration and Development was set up to enable the member states of the forum to have a constructive dialogue among states in an informal, voluntary setting in order to avoid the very unfortunate regional polarization that we so often have seen within the UN family and the UN system. And it has often plagued earlier attempts at discussing migration in particular. We very often sort of bump back or jump back to the north-south battles. In view of this, I'm not convinced that it would be, well, conducive for the European Union to speak with one voice in these circumstances, as it could jeopardize the constructive tone that these discussions have taken. And we might run the risk of doing exactly what I mentioned, namely fall back into the regionally blocked positions. So this is my...
I understand that, but does that also mean that you wouldn't want to see, for example, the Commission there at the Global Forum talking about the issues for which they do have some responsibility, like development aid and so on? Or is it just... So are you talking only about the idea of the EU speaking with a single voice at the forum, which I understand your position, which you've expressed very clearly, or is it also to even having the Commission there?
Well, I think that, my Lord Chairman, I think that one should be careful about, how should we say, using the Commission in a wrong way. The Commission definitely have a role to play when it comes to be a good fellow of the Global Forum of Migration and Development. That it definitely has. But as I said, I think it would be difficult to try and create a situation where it would be perceived by other member states of the Global Forum of Migration and Development as though EU were to be represented, as the EU family at the forum. This is where I think that we might differ in our opinion on whether this is a good or a bad thing. For my part and for the part of my government, I think that the Global Forum should be what it has become to be, what it has become, namely a good tool for a constructive dialogue. And it's very unfortunate if we replace this with a situation where EU instead is being perceived as becoming one bloc, because we are not one bloc. We are individual member states.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yes, Lord Stanley.
Does that mean that you would be in favour of observer status for the Commission or not?
Well, this is of course a question where I would like to be very clear on the matter. We want the Commission to play a part on the Global Forum, and so observer status is something which we of course would recognise as something beneficial to the process.
Thank you. Right. Lord Richard.
I wonder if I can come back to the Council, in which you're a very long-standing member. Indeed, I think you're the longest-standing member, if my information is correct. One of the things we're clearly going to have to look at is whether the institutional machinery of the EU is sufficient to deal with the problems that, in this area, that the EU is going to be faced with. I mean, what would you say about the approach of the Council to, and indeed its performance on migration issues as a whole? I was interested very much in the speech that you made to the LSE, where you said, when formulating policy on international migration and development, our overall aim must be, and I quote, to enable people to migrate out of choice rather than out of necessity. Now, if that's your sort of baseline, so to speak, how competent do you think the Council is to administer this approach?
My Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. I think that the links between migration and development must remain central to the EU policies on migration, and that includes the global approach, which should be our tool for achieving this. And I think, however, that there is certainly a development potential in mobility, not least when people choose to move back and forth between their countries of origin and destination, which is what I would like to call circular migration. I think, however, that it needs to be pointed out that it's always and should always be up to the individual member states to choose the number of migrants. And now we're speaking about labour migrants. I put the asylum seekers in a separate queue because they are governed by separate rules, as we all know. But I think that one should be very clear on this matter. It should always be up to the individual member states to choose the individual number of migrants that they want to admit to their labour markets. However, this doesn't mean that we can't cooperate, and we have seen some fairly interesting initiatives taken in later years. The framework directive on applications was one such initiative, which enable us to streamline the actual application procedure when a labour migrant wants to seek access to the European Union. Less bureaucracy, and it makes it much more easier for the migrant to pick and choose, which I think is a good thing, because I want to see competition between the individual member states. That would be beneficial for my country, which is a small country. Only 9 million people in this world speak Swedish as their first language. We are in no position to compete with the UK, or France, or Germany, or Italy. We have to find our own ways. But doing this within the EU means that we have to operate some sort of procedure which is similar, but opportunities for people to put in what they want to put in, like special treatments for migrants who choose individual countries. Thank you very much.
Both in EU Council and in the Forum, you are trying to coordinate policy and you're looking ahead. How much discussion together did you have about the implications of Rio Plus for the future of migration?
My Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. I don't think that the Council yet has been able to, how should we say, assess the Rio Plus yet. That might come to pass in the fullness of time, but not yet. And so my answer has to be very short. I think it's a very interesting document, and I think that there is definitely some room to look into what the consequences of increased global heating, global warming, might pose in terms of migration.
Would it be fair to say that the preoccupation of both the Council and the Forum in their deliberations is with Eurocentric matters rather than the global dimensions of migration, which are very central to the issues of Rio?
Thank you very much for the question. My Lord Chairman, I think that, well, we all know that there are different roads ahead that we can choose when it comes to migration. We can choose to have a proactive or a reactive attitude towards the subjects being brought forward by Lord Judge. I personally think that both the Council and the Forum have to busy themselves with talking about the Rio Plus conclusions. And I think that when we sit down and talk about the matters ahead in terms of migration development, we cannot overlook the fact, and that was mentioned before by Lord Richard, that people migrating out of choice rather than necessity is definitely to prefer. However, we might see a development in the years to come where some countries might have to suffer the consequences of global warming. Now, I don't have a full answer to what we should do in a situation where a large part of, let's say, Bangladesh gradually will perhaps not disappear, but at least be more and more flooded. This has to be taken into consideration. And I think that we need to look very closely on this in many forums. The Council, our own institutions of the European Union, the Global Forum as an operational platform for the UN family, but not within the UN system. And finally, of course, also we have to speak about this in, well, how should we say, the top places of this world, like the Security Council of the United Nations. Sooner or later we will have to take some sort of position on what we should do in such a situation. Thank you.
You ask?
You said that it was obviously for each individual member state to determine the numbers of migrants that it would admit, but would you qualify that by saying you refer to primary migrants and not to dependents? And what would your attitude be to the rights of dependents of primary migrants to enter the countries to join the heads of households? Do you think that the European Union has a responsibility to make sure that, for example, the provisions of Article 8 of the Human Rights Treaty are observed in terms of family unity, and that there should therefore be some degree of harmonisation within Europe about the rules for dependents entering to join heads of household?
Well, my Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. I think it's very important to draw the line between asylum seekers and refugees on one side and the rights pertaining to their residence permit on one hand, and on the other hand labour migrants, businessmen, students, etc., which fall into a quite different category.
Yes, I was talking about people who obtain permanent settlement.
But
whether via the asylum route or through the work route, as most of them do. We admit people to come here for long-term purposes of work, then normally they gain settlement at the end of the day. So they're then in the same position as somebody who's been granted refugee status regarding the right to bring their families here to join them.
Well, my Lord Chairman, thank you very much for this clarification, and I will try to be very, very clear on the matter as well. I can, of course, only speak for the Swedish system because I'm a representative here today of the Swedish government. And the Swedish government looks very favorably on people who want to bring their families with them as migrants when they come to our country as labour migrants. If we look at the recently, 2008, undertaken Act on Labour Migration, we can see that one very important point in this Act is that a worker is allowed to bring his or her family to Sweden from day one. That includes spouse and children, and the accompanying spouse also gains full access to the labour market. And this is, of course, something which is very important for us. This is a competitive tool. We need to encourage people to choose our country over other countries. And one way of doing this is allowing people to bring their spouse and their children, which for many migrants are an important feature. For others, it is not. Young men and women who have not yet formed a family have, for obvious reasons, no spouse and no children to bring with them. And they very often want to do the job on the labour market and then go home to form a family and create a home for themselves in their country of origin. But you have to allow for both. That is my personal opinion. And I think that we have done the right way. However, it is not up to me to advise any other government of how they want to create or act out their policies.
Thank you very much. That was good. Lord Bridgman.
Chairman. You've referred in your paper to the domestic policy of the Swedish government. The Chairman's taken up your point about the individual preferences of the different countries, and Lord Avery also referred to it. Can you tell us, amplify a little more about the Swedish domestic policy? I know you've already referred to it slightly.
My Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. Yes, as I mentioned, I presented a new goal for the Swedish migration policy when I took up office 6 years ago, with the purpose of increasing opportunities for labour migrants in order to make it easier for employers to recruit persons from countries outside of the EU. And Sweden has, with this reform, gone from a 40-year-old non-labour immigration policy to the most open and liberal system for economic migration in the OECD family. And if my Lord Chairman permit me, I would like to present to the committee at the end of this session with this report from the OECD, which was presented on the 19th of December last year, which gives a full account of how the Swedish system works and might be helpful for the committee. In brief, I'll just mention that the main features of the systems are that it's not based on quotas or bilateral agreements. The system is completely demand-driven. It is now the employer and not a state agency who decides if and when there is a need to recruit labour. The same rules and conditions apply to all labour migrants, and the Swedish system welcomes migrants of all skill levels, both high and low skilled workers. The key requirement is that the job offered provides a sufficient living and that the salary and other terms of employment comply with the collective agreements, follow the practice of the profession of or the industry. An initial permit is granted for a maximum of 2 years. If the individual in question still has a valid contract after this 2-year period, it is possible to extend the permit for an additional 2 years. After 4 years, a permanent residence permit can be granted. I've already mentioned the important feature about bringing your spouse, etc. Labour migrants and their accompanying family members gain access to more or less the same rights and obligations as Swedish citizens. Voting rights are excluded for obvious reasons. And finally, I'll just mention that the interesting thing, which is also observed by the OECD in their assessment report, is that we have not seen a huge influx of labour migrants, but a relatively low influx can, at least in part, be due to the fact that the reform entered into force during the unfortunate global financial crisis which we are now experiencing. And during the first 3 years, a total of approximately 50,000 work permits have been granted, and the largest groups of professions, except for seasonal workers, are computing professionals, restaurant workers, architects and engineers. This, I think, is very interesting. It shows that in spite of the fact that we have the most open and the most liberal system in the entire OECD family, you still don't get very many migrants. That is perhaps some food for thought in the present debate which is raging around the world about whether open or closed migration policies are a good or a bad thing. Thank you.
Right. Lord... Oh, Baroness Crashaw, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman. Right.
In your very interesting talk at the LSC, you discussed the importance of migration policies for development and also the connection between development and circular migration. What more do you think the EU should be doing to foster development potential of migration?
Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. I think that we have to work more on facilitating the connection between migration and development. I think that this is important for many reasons. It is important because circular migration can definitely generate advantages for both the country of origin, destination, and also for the individual, him or herself. This is why I would like to emphasize that it is important to have a greater consensus on migration and development policies within the European Union with regards to measures aiming at facilitating circular migration. And more consultation, more cooperation between governments and international organizations are required, both at the international and at the European level. And such efforts must be based upon a better understanding of the close relationship between international migration and development and other key policy areas and issues such as trade, development aid, foreign and security policy, and human rights, of course. And it is also important that member states are seeing increased mobility as something positive, both for the European Union and countries of origin, even during an economic crisis. So freedom of movement is one of the key achievements of European cooperation. And I think that it is desirable for this freedom to be extended to persons who come to Europe to work, study to a higher degree, and not at least in order to increase the attractiveness of Europe and thereby meet future labour needs. Otherwise, there are other countries who are up and running. The US, Canada, Australia, and in the future, India, China, Russia, Brazil and South Africa, who are also, in my opinion, destined to be countries of destination for migrants. Thank you.
But you talk about facilitating the dialogue. What should be the respective role of the European Union and that of the member states in this process?
Well, as I said before, we have to work on several different layers at the same time. Personally, I think that in order to facilitate circular migration, each and every single member state of the European Union have to sit down and make an assessment procedure. And we are on the way of doing this. I instituted, the Cabinet decided in 2009 to appoint a parliamentary committee on the matter of circular migration. The first one, I think, on a global scale. I haven't heard of another one. And the findings of this report was not only a very unanimous report by this parliamentary committee, but it also showed that there are still a lot of things to do. How do you work with social security systems, for instance? How do you facilitate them in a way that makes it attractive for migrants to move across borders several times? What about migration laws? How long can you stay away from your country before you lose social benefits? And how much possibilities are there for making those rights portable? These are all issues which we have to take into account, but we have to do this on an individual level because our systems in the European Union are not coherent. The system in the UK is not the same social security as it is in Sweden or Germany or other member states. But it needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. And you touched on this to some extent already, but what's your view of the impact of the global economic and financial crisis on migration trends, both in the short and the medium term?
My Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. Well, the phenomenon of migration will not disappear, just as I mentioned to Baroness Russia. Neither in short or medium terms will we see a downturn in the trends of migration. People will always want to move for one reason or another, and global economic crisis will come to, well, to some extent influence this, but I'm certain that there will always be a need and demand for migration, although there might of course be fluctuations over time. If we're taking the Swedish system again as an example, here we have not seen a huge influx of labour migrants. As I said, some might have expected that with such an open system. But since it is now the employer and not an agency who decides if and when there is a need to recruit labour, the Swedish system can respond to different economic climates, which is of course one of the great advantages with this legislation. There is no need for a separate political process every time the economy starts to move up or down. The system is already in place and it is self-sustainable. Thank you.
In answer to an earlier question, you told us about the principal categories of migrants for whom employers were demanding work permits, and amongst those were restaurant workers. Don't you think that there is scope for variation of host countries' migration policies in an era of mass unemployment, because your restaurant workers could be trained to do the jobs and reduce the scale of unemployment in Sweden? And I'm thinking of our own experience where what we call Tier 5 migrants, who are people without any technical skills, are now no longer admitted, because we say to employers, if you want to cook or something like that, then you jolly well train them from the unemployed. And don't you think that Europe as a whole should consider variations of its migration policies to suit its own internal employment situations?
My Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. It's one that I have been asked before, I would like to mention. And my answer would be this. For a handful of occupations, if we look at the Swedish migration system, we can see that computing professionals, for them, labour migration makes up a significant contribution to employment. According to the OECD review, I think it's about half of the recruitments are in occupational groups which are considered to be in shortage in Sweden. And the largest occupational groups I've already mentioned. But however, even if there is unemployment among restaurant workers, there is also a shortage of chefs, which belong to the same occupational group. Very clear. To me, it's not too alarming if it's only about half of the labour migrants who are working in occupations considered to be in shortage. In my opinion, it is the individual employer who knows the recruitment needs of his or her own company best, which is why the system of Sweden is demand-driven, and not, for an example, controlled by an agency's assessment of Sweden's need for labour migration, because no agency or no organisation are in a position to do that sort of job. Simply impossible to be able to do it on such a detailed level. And I think also that it is important to remember that a certain occupation can be in shortage locally without being considered to be in shortage in Sweden in general. That might apply for other countries as well, including the UK. And it is furthermore a challenge to reach all different groups of employers in Sweden and potential labour migrants in countries outside of the EU with information about the Swedish system. So that could, of course, therefore be a reason for Sweden to analyse if we, by increasing information efforts, can facilitate labour immigration from third countries based on the needs of Swedish employers. But that is, after all, a minor detail if we relate it to the overall picture. Thank you.
I'm sorry for my ignorance, but I can't remember whether Sweden admitted migrants from the new member states in Central and Eastern Europe immediately without transitional provisions like the UK did, or whether you applied some of the transitional provisions. And if so, what were the effect on the flows?
Thank you very much, my Lord Chairman, for the question. It is an important one. Sweden decided very clearly not to impose any transitional rules against the new member states, and we choose not to do so again in the autumn of 2006. It was one of my first decisions when Bulgaria and Romania was about to enter the European Union as new member states. The flows from the new countries to Sweden have been quite insignificant. If we look at the overall figures, we speak about approximately 11,000 people who arrived in the years right after the enlargement procedure took place in 2004-2005. And we can see that the majority of those who came were Polish citizens who came to Sweden to work in the healthcare sector, along with some people from the Baltic states who joined the construction sector. That was about it. And in my opinion, as I have stated very clearly in the Swedish media debate, this was a disaster, because it showed very clearly that Sweden wasn't the attractive country that we might have thought of. It was. As a matter of fact, it showed the opposite, that we have to stretch our efforts even further away if we want to recruit people to our labour market. Because we are a small country, small but good country, small but open country, but a small country in relation to language, and we have to take account of this in our political decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lord Jard.
May I just slip in a question at this point, because you are very, I think, rightly proud of your open tradition in Sweden. You've also said it's not your job to tell other governments what to do. But from your position, as if I may say so, an enlightened minister, would you agree that historical, cultural and language dimensions have perhaps considerable part to play in differences of performance in policy across the community?
My Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. Yes, as I was stating before, I'm not in a position, I don't think it's my job to tell any other countries' governments what to do. But if we can act as a role model, we in Sweden, we are happy to do so, to provide very clear evidence of what actually happens when you put forward a very, very open system. We are quite happy to do so. However, your question was directed towards differences, and I think that we should perhaps talk about differences but also similarities. We, the countries who believe in free trade, in openness, and in mobility, and see that this has throughout the ages, always throughout history, led to increased, better economic opportunities for the countries of both destination and origin if we do things in a well-managed way. Perhaps we should join hands in a situation where we can see that other states are not in preference of mobility and migration whatsoever. This, I think, is my answer. Then things have to be, how should we say, dealt with from your point of view, from cultural, language-based and other historical viewpoints. But it's a different thing.
What about the demographic trends in Europe, which are very marked in some parts of the European Union, less so in others? How do you think that's likely to impact on migration policies? And indeed, should those policies be expected to take into account the probable demographic trends?
My Lord Chairman, this is a very important issue and one which has played a considerable part in forming the debate on migration. Our population is getting older, and a smaller proportion of people of working age will therefore have to support an increasing percentage of the population in the future. And in the long term, this poses a serious challenge to the sustainability of our welfare systems. And in order to successfully address these challenges, I think we have to have a forward-looking and broad political strategy in our minds. It is really required. And in this regard, labour immigration is part of Sweden's strategy for economic development, in the immediate and in the long-term run. Facilitating growth of the European labour force by opening up for legal migration from third countries is essential in order to ensure that our labour markets remain diverse and vibrant. And it is also, I think, crucial for achieving the targets set out in EU's growth strategy, EU 2020. And to be even more precise in answering your question, what role can migration policies play in addressing demographic change in Europe? Well, the demographic trend in Sweden and the EU reinforces the need for migration to Sweden and to the EU. In order to be able to compete for international labour, we will have to become an attractive destination for migrants. However, I would also like to underline that migration cannot compensate altogether for an aging population, but migrants might be a welcome contribution to fill the gaps of the labour market. Many of the labour migrants may not come to Sweden with the intention of staying there permanently, but rather with the aim of staying a few years to gain experience, to develop skills, etc., etc. And an enabling legal framework that allows migrant workers to be flexible can be an important part of a policy to address the demands of the labour market related to the demographic change. Thank you.
Yes, Lord Judge.
You referred to the competition in migration, which you see developing, coming from China and places in the future. Can you just say a word or two for the record about how you see demographic developments within countries like China, Brazil and so on affecting the total situation?
Well, my Lord Chairman, I think that it's difficult to give you an overall picture because things are now happening very rapidly as well in China as well in other countries who are experiencing economic development. We can see trends which point to a very clear downturn in the nativity rate of countries both of the EU who are experiencing economic development. Poland is an excellent example of this, but also outside. And I think that, well, it is not just a question of counting heads, but also what is within the heads. What sort of migrants are needed on the labour market. And countries who are now rapidly expanding economically, like China, Brazil, South Africa, India, etc., might or might not be able to fill some of the gaps which they're experiencing themselves. But it might also be different. And this is where I think that we will have to look at the whole scoreboard of competition when we view these matters, and understand that the European Union and the member states of the European Union might not be on the top 10 priorities among potential labour migrants in the future. Sweden is already outside of the top 10. I know it because I have seen the statistics and the figures myself. Thank you.
Lord Sharkey.
There has been a significant domestic politicisation of immigration issues across the EU, and there's been a rise in support for populist anti-immigrant parties in some member states. And in these circumstances, how can member states in the EU pursue migration policies that, on the one hand, meet employer demand, and at the same time, reassure the public?
My Lord Chairman, thank you very much for the question. As I said before, Sweden is an open country, and we welcome migration, whether a person comes to Sweden as a refugee or to work or to study. It is also an important point to make that the public debate in Sweden regarding migration policy is not characterized by xenophobia or anti-immigration opinions. On the contrary, the debate in Sweden concerning labour immigration is mainly focused on the working conditions of these migrants, while in Sweden and in the needs to ensure that labour migrants receive terms of employment in line with the Swedish standards. And I would also like to mention, for the record, that long-time studies by the SOM Institute, which is an acronym for Society Opinion Media, has been conducted in Sweden, and the most recent report, published yesterday incidentally, indicates that the proportion who think it would be good to accept fewer refugees has declined to 41% over the past 8 years. And comparing to 1993, when 65% of the Swedes were of the opinion that Sweden should receive fewer refugees, we are experiencing a downward trend when it comes to anti-immigration, not a rising one. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Could I
please.
Would you like to speculate as to why that is the case?
My Lord Chairman, I think it has to do with many things. Partly the fact that we are a people who like to be, how should we say, standing on facts when we make our decisions. And I'm not saying this in any how should I say, relation to other countries around the world, but I think that you need to have a situation where politicians, when they make their statements, actually are fact-based when they do them. And this also brings me to my second observation, that I think that we also need to understand that, yes, migration is an emotional thing, very much so. But emotions also need to be checked. You need to be, how should we say, able as a politician, not just to lift your finger up in the air, but also to say, you know, after all, we know that openness towards migration and mobility pays off for everybody involved if we do things the right way. Well managed, organized, structured. We like those words in Sweden, as I'm sure that the committee are aware of, but so do other countries. I don't see the UK less organized and less structured than what Sweden is, but sometimes we have to understand that it is in this way that we can safeguard and protect the idea that legal migration is beneficial for everybody involved. And thirdly, we have had a media climate where people also oppose if individual newspapers and individual media channels say things which is, how should we say, crude, not fact-based, and based upon pure emotions. That has happened throughout the decades through my political career. I've witnessed and experienced how people react when things are not based upon facts. And I think it's good if we have that attitude. I would like to see more of it on a global scale as well. Thank you.
One of the things that strikes me distant you is that you see in the future some kind of almost competition between the various European countries for migrants to come in. In other words, that one country is going to be disadvantaged because it doesn't get its fair share, whatever the fair share is, of the migrants that are available, which it needs. I come back really to where I started from, which is this question of the European institutions. I mean, how far do you think the European institutions should actually be playing a more active role in trying to produce not a coordinated, but a more coherent European migration policy at a European level now? I mean, Sweden has its preoccupations and its problems, things it wants to sort out. France has its own, we have ours. Different countries have different views about these things. But to what extent do you think the institutions of the EU should try and pull the things together? And secondly, to what extent do you think they could succeed in putting the things together?
My Lord Chairman, thank you very much for also a very important question, because I think that we should separate two issues here. One is what the EU should do, and one is what the EU should not do. The EU should definitely operate a system where we see to it that individual labour migrants who wants to choose, pick and choose if you want to use the term, the country which they prefer among the 27 members of our family, are able to do so, to make an assessment which is fair and which is structured. And this can be done through framework directives, which we then implement on a national level. And it's already happening. The British Parliament will be able, if it hasn't already done so, to see to it that this framework directive relating to the opportunity to hand in a joint application for both residence and work permit is being brought forward. That has, of course, already been adopted by the Council and Parliament jointly, so it's underway. Secondly, what the EU should not do, however, is to act as a referee. That it should only do in relation to the directives which we have agreed upon. But the EU has, in my mind, no role to play when it comes to instituting quotas or point system or any sort of determination of how many migrants should arrive in a particular country at a particular time. That should be left to the member states completely. And there are good reasons for it, because one is that if we were to institute such an EU system, it would not benefit the smaller member states. It would benefit the larger member states who already have an advantage in the language area. So I think that it's very good to have this competition between ourselves. If we want, and I speak for Sweden, offer migrants better terms and conditions, we should be able to do so. If the UK wants to do the same in terms of the length of time that you can stay, the rights pertaining to residency permit, etc., you should be able to do so. The Blue Card Directive, however, has been an element of discussion in this. I have been somewhat diverted, cloven perhaps, of the matter of the Blue Card Directive. I think it will be very interesting to see how it works out when it's now being implemented in each and every member state. I think it's a good step forward to opening up for migrants to come. But I think that maybe if we look at the relationship between the Blue Card Directive and the Swedish system, we see that there are actually some advantages with the Swedish system, which the Blue Card Directive couldn't actually achieve and couldn't give to the individual migrant. So I think that will definitely needs to be assessed after some time, this Blue Card Directive.
Really, you want the EU to sort of referee the competition which takes place between the different countries?
No, I want the
Make
EU...
sure that if one country doesn't get an unfair advantage over another country, it's attraction for the migrants.
No, my Lord Chairman, the only position that I can see for the European Union, and especially the Commission of the European Union, is of course in relationship to the directives that we have agreed upon the relation between the Council and the European Parliament. It's only in that regard, only in that sense, that I can see a role for the Commission, not as a referee when it comes to determining whether one state or another should be able to bring in a set number of migrants.
No, but you've got to ensure the playing field is flat, haven't you? It's the much hackneyed phrase.
That's not a bad way of expressing things.
But anyway, you will be able to run a controlled experiment on whether the blue card is a good thing or not, because Britain, of course, has not opted into it.
Exactly, and my Lord Chairman, since we will be happy to once again provide you with a laboratory to see how things work out. Thank you very much.
Lord Linfield, and I should explain that I'm striving might and main to get our witness to the Prime Minister's questions at 12 o'clock. So can we move through this question, the last question, fairly rapidly?
Well, for the reasons you've explained, you want to make Sweden more attractive to migrants. What has been your approach to integration, therefore, and to multiculturalism? And would you be kind and mention particularly what effect such an approach might have on schools, colleges, and universities?
Mm-hmm. Well, my Lord Chairman, this is of course a lengthy question, but I will try to be as brief or it requires a lengthy answer, I should say. The question in itself was not lengthy, but it needs to be looked upon very closely. I would like to point out, first of all, that the goal of integration policy in Sweden is equal rights, obligations and opportunities for all, regardless of ethnic and cultural background. And these policy objectives are to be achieved primarily through general policy measures for the whole population, supplemented by targeted support for the introduction of newly arrived immigrants during their first years in Sweden. More job opportunities, better schools and possibilities to learn the Swedish language quicker are cornerstones of our integration policy. A major reform, the Introduction Act, entered into force on the 1st of December 2010 to speed up the introduction of newly arrived immigrants to working and social life. And I should point out that we are not talking about labour migrants here, we are talking exclusively about refugees, asylum seekers, and also to some extent their family members. The reform is based around individual responsibility with professional support and includes strengthening incentives to find a job and participate in introduction programs. And newly arrived immigrants covered by the Introduction Act now have a statutory right to employment preparation activities, civic orientation and language courses. And although integration policy primarily is a national competence to be handled at the local level, the EU member states share common challenges, not least in the areas of labour market inclusion and social cohesion. So to cooperate and exchange information and experiences in the integration field at the EU level is therefore vital for a successful integration at the national level. And finally, successful integration of immigrants continues to pose a challenge for Sweden. And the time it takes for newly arrived immigrants of refugee background to find work in Sweden is still too long. On average, only some 50% of men have a job 5 years after being granted a residence permit, and for women the corresponding figure is 30%. So lower employment rates among foreign-born compared to native-born is also a major challenge, particularly for refugees and their families, and for persons born outside of EU. And the government follows closely the implementation of the Introduction Act through, for example, continuous dialogue with the responsible authorities. And although it is still too early to draw any firm conclusions from the introduction reform, one marked improvement is that over 90% of participants in introduction activities have received some form of employment preparation activities. Only 10% are so far outside of the system. And this, I think, is a fairly good achievement for something which has been in place for a short period of time. Thank you very much.
Yes, do you have any follow-up question?
Very briefly, do you think that the European Union has a role to play as far as integration is concerned?
My Lord Chairman, last year's Commission communication on the European agenda for the integration of third country nationals reiterated the importance of labour market inclusion of migrants. And a successful and effective inclusion and integration is the starting point for both individuals and society to fully benefit from the positive potential of migration for these particular groups. Labour migration is one of the important tools to achieve the goals set out. Europe needs to create a flexible policy in this area. That also calls for efficient integration policies. But, and I mentioned this before in my first part of my answer to your question, I think that we have to understand that it's not it's not an EU competence, it's a national competence. So it's one thing to try and gain good experience from one another. It's a completely different thing to try and maneuver something like an overall EU integration policy forward. And I don't think that that will happen in the near future, if it ever happens, because of the differences in our social security systems and our labour markets.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Minister, for coming here, and thank you even more for the clearness and eloquence of your testimony, which is really valuable to us in our inquiry, and will give us much food for thought. And meanwhile, I think we've just about got time to get you down to the Prime Minister's questions, which will be a lot less polite and quiet than here. That I can assure you.
But fact-based. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Committee Room 3, Sound.